You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Because history is not just about the past. History is about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a better future. So people, let's do this. Greetings, one and all. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane for April 28th, 2016. We are coming to you this week from the Bank War Studios, located somewhere outside of Boston, Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook and Twitter, where my handle is @InThePastLane. At the control board, as always, is our magnificent executive producer, Lulu Spencer. Hey people, do you have 60 seconds to donate to a worthy cause? Well, if you like this podcast, we would greatly appreciate it if you'd head over to iTunes or Stitcher and do two things. First, subscribe to the In the Past Lane podcast. It's free, and it guarantees that every new episode of In the Past Lane is automatically downloaded to your listening device. And subscribing also allows you to listen to In the Past Lane's entire archive of past episodes. And then, after subscribing, we'd really appreciate it if you left a review. Reviews are so very important for pulling in new listeners, and it only takes a minute to leave one. Thanks. So what's happening at In the Past Lane this week? Well, let's just say that we've been inspired by the announcement by the U.S. Treasury Department that former slave and abolitionist Harriet Tubman would replace President Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. We will start with a short piece that answers the question, who was Harriet Tubman? If I do my job, you'll gain a deeper appreciation of this incredible and for a long time unsung figure from the American past. Next, we turn to an interview with Catherine Clinton, the historian who literally wrote the book on Harriet Tubman. We'll learn a lot more about Tubman, including her exploits as a scout, spy, and military leader during the Civil War. Did you know that Tubman was the first woman in American history to lead a U.S. Army expedition in a military assault? Well then, better stay tuned. And finally, we turn to one of In the Past Lane's senior historical correspondents, historian Stephanie Yuhl, to talk about history in the news. It's the feature we call the History Skinny, and you won't want to miss it. Okay, people, the weather is fine, so let's put the top down. Your journey in the Past Lane begins now. Well, the big news this week, news pertaining to history, of course, was the announcement by the U.S. Treasury Department that former slave and abolitionist Harriet Tubman would displace President Andrew Jackson from the front of the $20 bill. This announcement ended months of speculation over which new historical figures, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Eleanor Roosevelt, Martin Luther King, and so on, would appear on U.S. paper currency, and, equally important, what traditional figures would be removed or at least demoted. For a time, the focus had been on removing Alexander Hamilton from the $10 bill, but he held on to his place due to the tremendous popularity of the Broadway hit musical Hamilton the Musical. The focus then shifted to the $20 bill. Andrew Jackson, slaveholder and Indian slaughterer, it seems, didn't have as big a cheering section as Hamilton. Maybe that's because the last major musical about the seventh president was titled Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson. Yeah, you don't hear anybody humming that song on the subway. Well, in any case, we will get into the significance of this move to put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill in our next few segments. For now, let's take a few minutes to answer the basic question. Who was Harriet Tubman? Let's start with a revealing story. On April 27, 1860, Harriet Tubman was in Troy, New York. She wasn't there for any business. She was just visiting a relative on her way to Boston. But, as fate would have it, there was another self-emancipated former slave in Troy, New York that day. Charles Nall had been seized as an escaped slave by a U.S. deputy marshal, who remanded him to a local judge. Now, if this case went like most escaped slave cases in the 1850s, Charles Nowell would soon be on a boat bound for his former owner's farm in Virginia. But not today. Not after Harriet Tubman learned of Nowell's plight. Troy, New York had a strong community of abolitionists, and it was an important stop on the Underground Railroad. These abolitionists had formed a vigilance committee, whose job it was to assist escaped slaves and to thwart slave catchers trying to bring them back into bondage. Tubman met with the vigilance committee, and they decided to stop Nowell's return to slavery. Hundreds of abolitionists, both black and white, soon gathered outside the building where Nowell was being held. Tubman disguised herself as a meek servant, selling food from a basket, and positioned herself right near the doorway. As soon as Nowell appeared, Tubman shouted, "Here he comes! Take him!" Tubman then grabbed Nowell and began to fight off the policemen guarding him. A riot broke out as Tubman and her fellow abolitionists battled it out with court officers, police, and supporters of slavery. Tubman was struck several times, but she never let go of Nowell until he reached a waiting ferry at a nearby river. Another melee broke out when they reached the other side of the river, when officers there also tried to apprehend Nowell. Tubman and the others fought them off, and before long, Charles Nowell was on his way to safety. For Harriet Tubman, it was all in a day's work. Slavery was war, as she often said, and she was ready to do battle on behalf of freedom anytime, anywhere. So where did this extraordinary woman come from? Harriet Tubman was born a slave in Dorchester County, Maryland. Like so many enslaved people, she knew neither the day nor the year in which she was born. It was probably around 1820. Her birth name was Araminta Ross, and she was one of 9 children. Growing up in slavery exposed Araminta, or Minty as she was known, to many hardships. She suffered beatings and bore the scars of whippings on her back. On one occasion, when she was just a teenager, an enraged white man smashed the side of her head with a weight, causing a serious traumatic brain injury. The young Tubman nearly died, and for the rest of her life, she suffered seizures and occasionally entered into a trance-like state. Tubman also suffered the loss of 3 sisters, who were sold off to faraway plantations by the family that owned them. But to the owner, who needed money, they were property. Same as cows, same as mules. So that was that. When Minty was 24 years of age, she married John Tubman, a free black man. It was not unusual at this time, 1844, and place, the Upper South along Maryland's eastern shore, to find black men like John Tubman married to enslaved women, or vice versa. In fact, about half the African Americans living in the region were free. We don't know much about this marriage, except that the couple had no children. And I should point out that if they had, all of the children would have been slaves, since the law said a child inherited its mother's status. We also know that Minty changed her name to Harriet, same as her mother's. Tubman and John lived together for 5 years. Then something occurred that enslaved people dreaded. Harriet's owner died. Death of an owner often meant the breakup of slave families. They'd be sold off along with pigs and horses and other forms of property to resolve debts and settle the estate. Well, Harriet decided she was not going to wait around to see how things played out. So on September 17th, 1849, she bolted for freedom. The Pennsylvania border was only 90 miles away. Traveling at night, she moved along the invisible Underground Railroad, a network of safe houses owned by people dedicated, at great personal risk, to helping slaves escape to freedom in the North. Eventually, Tubman crossed into Pennsylvania. The feeling overwhelmed her. Let's listen to what she had to say. "When I found that I had crossed the line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven." With the help of abolitionists, Tubman settled in Philadelphia. But a little over a year later, in December 1850, she did what most escaped slaves considered unthinkable, even suicidal. She crossed back into the slave South to guide some family members to freedom along the Underground Railroad. And then she did it again, and again, and again, for years. And not just any years. The Fugitive Slave Act had been passed in 1850, so this was perhaps the most perilous time in U.S. history for anyone to attempt to escape slavery. And yet, year after year, Harriet Tubman put on a costume and assumed a false identity and crossed back into the land where she was considered property. At the very least, she risked capture and re-enslavement. At the worst, death at the end of a hangman's noose. Her admirers, they called her Moses, in reference to the biblical Moses who led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. Southerners, they called for her head. All told, Harriet Tubman probably guided about 70 enslaved people to freedom. In addition, her example probably inspired hundreds more to escape, and it inspired countless whites and blacks to join the Underground Railroad movement. But as we will learn in a moment, in our conversation with historian Catherine Clinton, there's a lot more to Harriet Tubman's story. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
Okay, we're back. With us now is Catherine Clinton. Catherine Clinton is a professor of history at the University of Texas at San Antonio. She is the author of many books, including Harriet Tubman, The Road to Freedom. Catherine Clinton, thank you for joining us at In the Past Lane.
Thank you so much, Ed.
Tubman has certainly been in the news a lot, so you're a person we're very eager to speak to. And what I'd like to do is start, you just wrote a fascinating piece for the History News Network that sort of told the story behind your work on Harriet Tubman. So maybe we could begin there by talking about your evolution as a historian and also the evolution of the historical field and how the story of how you came to write this book reflects some of that evolution.
Sure. I'm in the middle of a season of reflection as I'm president of the Southern Historical Association, which was the first historical conference I ever went to, my first one in 1975. So I've been thinking a lot about what constitutes Southern history, how it has transformed itself, and certainly looking at the way in which the topics we choose, the arguments we make, the historical forces at work have so much shaped new thinking, I think, about what is part of the American history narrative. I think, for example, when I started out, almost all my professors used the term the master narrative. And of course, as I was working on slavery and the dynamics of gender and race, I found language a really important issue. And when people would use the term Southern, they would almost always be talking about a white or a Confederate perspective as I worked on the 19th century. So language has changed, but so have the way in which we refine and filter and add to the subjects we debate.
Yeah, and looking at Tubman in particular, her story is quite fascinating, yet you discovered early on in your work that there had been a lot of children's books and a lot of young adult books written about Tubman, but really no serious treatment of her life for decades when you began to think about it in the 70s and 80s.
Absolutely. So I'm very grateful both that I decided to look at all the children's books that my own children were reading, and that I took a hiatus from teaching on a campus and instead decided to become a full-time writer in 1991. And during that 15-year period, when I was both writing full-time, taking visiting positions, and raising my two boys, I confronted the issue of popular history versus academic history, and that was something that fascinated me, because Tubman was such a central figure in the minds of American school children. Indeed, as I said, there were about 30 books in print at the turn of the 21st century, and yet I found that when I wanted to explore her in the university libraries, she was conspicuously absent, and she seemed to be someone who was high on name recognition, but very little awareness of the extent of her career, what she did, and I found that really something that I wanted to address in my own work. Sojourner Truth, by comparison, had several biographies written about her, several were in the works. She seemed to be someone much more intriguing to academic historians rather than Tubman, and I don't think it was simply a matter of resources. I think it was how she was cast and perceived within the academy. So that was something I wanted to address as well with a biography. It was the first biography in over 60 years. There were other people, of course, working on Tubman, and several books came out simultaneously. So it is true that she was neglected, but now I believe she really has found a recognition factor and is being integrated, of course, into the new views on the Underground Railroad with Eric Foner's new book, with a book by Fergus Bordewich, by several other leading scholars. We now can put the Underground Railroad into its rightful place as one of the great mass movements and self-emancipation, as well as the black and white hands together, is a really important part of our appreciation of both Tubman and her career as a conductor on the Underground Railroad.
Yes, I think one of the key understandings now that's gradually permeating the public consciousness is this idea of self-emancipation, because it runs up against the notions of enslaved people just simply waiting until they're emancipated by Union troops or by Lincoln. And if you change that view and go back several decades, you can see that there's decades of resistance and decades of efforts to self-emancipate and then to help others self-emancipate. And that's really the central thing, or the central story behind Tubman, is that she was this great facilitator, not only of her own emancipation, but of her family members and dozens of others.
And she was very symbolic, I think, at the time. She was a lone woman in a grassroots campaign that was dominated in many ways by males. She was known in her own day as an abductor, and that was someone who would go behind enemy lines, the slave, into slave territory, because slavery was war. That was something that Tubman proclaimed, and that was something she and John Brown agreed on. So if you saw her as a warrior, she was really going behind enemy lines and bringing people out. And there were only a handful of people in the years leading up to the Civil War who took on that role, and most were white men. And we know about them because many were jailed, and they were martyrs to the cause. But she was someone who escaped slavery because of her gender and her race. She was someone who could really disguise herself. She clearly had the cleverness and means to avoid detection. She often took money to buy a railway ticket to travel south, to go into slave territory, to try and bring out those who wanted to leave, those whose relatives had paid her. So she was really involved in the action and the operations against slavery during the period following her own self-emancipation.
It's important to point out, I think, that Tubman's case and her self-emancipation in 1849 coincides with, within just a few months of the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. So that when in 1850 she begins to make her first efforts to emancipate people, she's going back into the South at the most dangerous, most difficult time for somebody because there's more people on high alert for escaped slaves and Underground Railroad activists.
Surely, she was very much dedicating herself to rescuing others in a time when the infamous Bloodhound Law, as the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 was known, was in full force. She was courage embodied, she was shrewd, and she really was someone who was indeed an abductor, and risking her own freedom, her own safety, she went behind enemy lines. And she took people all the way up to Canada. She called it Under the Lion's Paw, referring to the British lion, taking people all the way to safety because, of course, the recapture of, quote, fugitive slaves, as they were called, was something that was greatly feared during the post-1850 period.
Yeah, and in fact, when she first began, or when the Underground Railroad's earliest manifestations, they just simply had to get people north to Philadelphia or to Boston, but with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, they really had to continue on to, taking them outside of the United States to ensure that they would not be recaptured. So it was a much more difficult task.
Right, and now that I'm living in San Antonio, Texas, and on the border, I'm seeing quite a few interesting parallels in terms of legality and residence and safety for people. It is interesting to see America as a country that embodies life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and yet struggles more than 150 years apart can echo one another.
That's true. I think Mark Twain put it best. He said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And this is a good example. It's not the same thing as the fugitive slave question in the 1850s, but there are just tremendous parallels.
Right. And Tubman herself was really fearful for her own family. She had found refuge in the communities in Pennsylvania, but she was able to go to Auburn, New York, and with the help of Senator William Seward, a very important abolitionist on the national scene, she was able to purchase her own household, her own home in Auburn, and reunite her family in later years. But at the time, she was taking people all the way up to St. Catharines in Ontario, as she wanted them out of the sights of slave catchers who were quite infamous during that period.
It's quite remarkable the consistent degree of physical courage and moral courage that she showed throughout these many stages of her work. Do you have a sense of how many people, I know it's an open question to some degree, but you see wildly disparate figures cited, but do we have a sense, you probably know more than anybody else, how many people we could safely say she helped spirit from slavery to freedom?
I don't think I know more than anyone else, because my fellow biographer, Kate Clifford Larson, insists that she has pinned down the number, and that's something that I don't agree with. I simply think that we can't know how many. We know that she acknowledged a certain number, but I do make the point that I think the numbers game is zero-sum, because however many people she took to safety before the Civil War broke out, we know that even rescuing just one, even going after her sister that first time, was an amazing, courageous moment. We also know that during the Civil War, she was a spy, she was an agent, she worked behind enemy lines, literally, in South Carolina with Union troops. There, she was at first helping the thousands of fugitives flowing in, but then certainly many of the military men saw her value. She was able to go into the slave territory alongside the Confederates, because the Confederates would often use enslaved labor, especially to set the mines, or torpedoes as they were called at the time, in the river. So she was able to go find the location of these torpedoes, inform the military leaders, and in one night in July 1863, she was able to help a raid of the Combahee River. And this nighttime military operation liberated over 750 slaves. And along the way, they, of course, destroyed millions of dollars worth of cotton dwellings, and they were really striking terror right in the heart of Dixie. And so I do try and say that imagine how gratifying it was for her when the Underground Railroad came above ground and was armed, and she was a soldier and a leader during the war, and her skills as an abductor led to her being an important asset to those who were in occupied territory, bringing these slaves to freedom. They also were, many of them, hundreds, enlisted in the Union cause and became soldiers. So she was also a recruiter during that period as well.
Yeah, it's another chapter. Certainly people are very familiar with her Underground Railroad work before the war, but that aspect of her many roles during the war, as a nurse, as a cook, as a spy, and as a guide, and then eventually, as you say, being the first woman to lead an armed raid on the Combahee River in 1863 and resulting in 700 or more slaves being freed, is another extraordinary chapter in her extraordinary life.
And one I think that's very little known. And this was something also that her physical strength needs to be emphasized. She herself had been struck by an iron weight when she was a teenager. She was a young girl. And after that, she was very, very ill. Her parents feared they would lose her, but she regained her strength. However, throughout adulthood, she had hypnagogic episodes where she would lose time. We don't know whether she was suffering from epilepsy, from narcolepsy. We just know that it adds even more layers of amazement that this 5-foot ferocious warrior against slavery, who herself was physically disabled, would be such a fierce military leader during the war.
It is an amazing aspect of her story. So after the Civil War, how does she spend? She lives a long time after the war. And
absolutely.
How would you characterize those years?
She felt the victory. But it was something I think that we can see as very short-lived, because she was given a military pass to return home on the railroad. Quite interesting that this railroad story intersects, as it does with other black women at the time. So Tubman is going back to Auburn, and she has this military pass, but the people running the railroad do not believe that a black woman is entitled to this. So she was physically lifted from her seat. It took 4 men and placed in a boxcar on her return home to Auburn. So even in the immediate wake of victory, in the immediate wake of the 13th Amendment and the destruction of slavery, she knows when she goes back that she's going to really be facing some hard times as racism is alive and well, North as well as South. She believed in education. She began to raise money for freed people. She also decided that there were many black veterans, there were many disabled people who were not able to survive after the war because, as Eric Foner has characterized, many of these ex-slaves were given, quote, nothing but freedom. And that created a drama in the Reconstruction era. So although she retired her guns, she established her Auburn household as a charity home for blacks. And it was really the only one in the state of New York outside of Manhattan. She had great financial difficulties. One year she didn't have the cash to pay the taxes on her own home, and she had to surrender cows to pay the debt. So many in upstate New York, knowing her charitable nature, tried to push for her to receive a pension for her work.
From the U.S. military.
From the U.S. military. And she had actually married a veteran. Nelson Davis and Tubman were married in 1869. In 1888, when he died, she applied for a pension, and she received the pension as a war widow. But there were those who claimed that this very small amount, $5, was not really suitable, that she herself had actually served in the military. Unfortunately, as a spy and scout, with an irregular appointment, she didn't have the proper documentation. But there were many of her former commanders, there were people in the Union military who wrote lengthy recommendations that she be given this pension. And indeed, the campaign for the pension lasted until the last year of the century. In 1899, she was given a pension of $20 to reward her for services. I think a lot of people are finding that sum quite ironic in terms of the news in the 21st century of her appearing on the $20 note.
It does seem appropriate, doesn't it?
In many ways, I think she fought very hard and long for this modest monthly sum, and it gave Tubman security. She wouldn't have to surrender the cows. She had a monthly and steady income. She could expand her operations to take in more people. And her home for aged and indigent colored people, which she opened in 1868, at that time would be secured because she would have the money to keep her operation going. So she had a dream of helping others, a dream of trying to be a humanitarian and expand her mission beyond collecting money for education, beyond trying to honor those Union veterans. And I think really it's remarkable to see the work and the respect she earned in her final years.
And now, in 2016, I know you've been involved for at least over a year now with the Women on the 20s campaign, and you've weighed in at early on saying you supported the idea of Harriet Tubman for the new $20 bill. Or I guess at that point it wasn't unclear which bills would be changed. But
I think many more have worked much harder than I have. I was trying to do my work to bring Harriet Tubman off the children's shelf and onto the platform so that we could really appreciate her role as a hero in American history. And as a result, it was my philosophy that we needed to let 100 Harriets bloom. And there was, I think, increasing acknowledgement of the significance of the Underground Railroad, of the work that women did during the American Civil War. Certainly that's another major campaign of mine. So incorporating that in has been a big, important movement in the field of women's history, in the field of African American history. And there's been really decades of work on this, and to see it come to fruition is exciting. I mean, most of us in the Academy are quite shocked, of course, when we read the headlines. The top article in the Washington Post might be, "Who is Harriet Tubman?" Mm-hmm. That she might have broken Google with the hits she got when she did make it onto the public platform. But there are hundreds and thousands of school children who know who Harriet Tubman is because her popularity really peaked at the turn of the century. It's still going strong in many ways. And imagine my complete shock, surprise, and pleasure that here we are in 2016 discussing Sojourner Truth on the back of the 10 and Harriet Tubman on the front of the 20. It's really something that I greet with surprise and delight, and it's the hard work of so many grassroots campaigners, the hard work of so many people working on getting women into the forefront of our historical consciousness.
Yes, and it certainly has generated a lot of conversation, and that's good because it's a symbol, but it's a very powerful symbol, and it reflects a lot of change, and it also indicates a more complete understanding of the past, which would be helpful for our present and our future.
And since I work on Lincoln was someone who was perfectly able to be flexible and to solicit the opinion of others. So it was to my great delight that the Secretary of the Treasury, Jacob Lew, was willing to actually solicit opinions and was so brave as to put the question out, who should be on the new 10 as the Treasury contemplated a design of the $10 bill, a redesign. And over 1 million hits came into the Treasury website with people nominating everyone, too many mothers being nominated. As I point out, the currency cannot have the image of a living person on it. But nevertheless, you saw such spontaneity and passion. And then, in the middle of it all, Lew decided really to pivot, because he'd listened to people. There was a movement to keep Hamilton on the 10. There was a movement to put Tubman on the 20. There was a movement to keep women, and many women, in the limelight. And I think it's really a marvel and something to be commended that allows us to see that we have an expanded conversation, a really vital, dramatic invention of putting a lot of women on the currency, so that we will know about these people who contributed so much to not only women's history, but to the American nation.
It's a happy ending or a good moment in American history, for certain. Well, I want to thank you for taking your time to talk to us at In the Past Lane. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much. Let's look forward to celebrating in 2020.
That's right. Hopefully you'll get some special treatment and be invited there for the first Chris
all I want
$20.
is for us to see 1 billion Tubmans in circulation, and that's reward enough.
That's going to be great. Well, Catherine Clinton is professor of history at the University of Texas at San Antonio. She's the author of many books, and we will include links to all of that information at our website. But most importantly for today, author of Harriet Tubman, The Road to Freedom. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Thank you.
So we've heard a lot about why Harriet Tubman belongs on the $20 bill. But what about the guy she's replacing? There are a lot of people who are upset about Andrew Jackson's demotion to the backside of the 20. Do they have a point? Is Jackson just another dead white male to fall victim to so-called political correctness? Well, let's look at this question from a couple different angles. First, some people are upset about moving Jackson because people often see change as a form of loss. But while this is understandable, it's also misguided. Remember, one of the 10 Commandments of history at In the Past Lane. Okay, we don't really have 10 Commandments of history. Let's say one of our guiding insights into history is nothing has always been. Nothing. Everything we think of as traditional has a point of origin that is probably not as far back in time as you think. For example, when did the United States decide it needed a massive peacetime military? 2 million soldiers, 500 ships, hundreds of bases all around the world. The year was 1950, less than 70 years ago. Before 1950, Americans agreed that a republic ought to have a small peacetime military, as small as possible. Then the Cold War happened, and we changed our mind. You get the idea. Okay, back to the $20 bill. We didn't even have federal paper money until 1862. That's 74 years after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. And then, in the coming years, many, many faces appeared on that paper money. Before Jackson, President Grover Cleveland's face appeared on the $20 bill. Jackson bumped him in 1928, a mere 88 years ago. So I could go on, but you know what I'm getting at. The look of U.S. paper money has changed many, many times. It wasn't designed by God or by George Washington. But let's keep going here. Let's widen the lens a little bit. Let's talk about the function of civic symbols. Civic symbols are everywhere. They represent efforts by a society to proclaim and affirm certain kinds of values. Naming public schools, establishing holidays, and building monuments to people or events. These actions, these civic symbols, are for the living, not the dead. And the selection of particular people to adorn U.S. currency performs a similar function. It says, in so many words, these people and what they stood for and what they did are worthy of our admiration. These are people from the past whose example we turn to inspire and to guide us as we go about living our present and building our future. It's this understanding that explains, in part, the decision to demote Andrew Jackson from his place of honor on the $20 bill. Simply put, American values have changed a lot since his presidency, which was 1829 to 1837, and they've changed a lot since his placement on the $20 bill in 1928. In his day, and for decades thereafter, Jackson was hailed as a man who expanded American democracy and defended the rights of the common man against the predations of the rich and politically connected. These are very important accomplishments, and this aspect of Jackson's reputation is largely accurate. But it's also incomplete. It obscures the fact that in Jackson's understanding, democracy and equal rights only applied to white men. And it ignores the fact that Jackson advanced the cause of these white men by promoting the expansion of slavery. Key to this policy was the opening of vast stretches of the American Southeast to white settlers for cotton cultivation by enslaved labor. And Jackson achieved this goal in defiance, mind you, of the U.S. Supreme Court by forcibly expelling tens of thousands of Native Americans from their homelands in the American Southeast. Their deadly forced march to Oklahoma killed thousands and became known as the Trail of Tears. These disturbing facts regarding Jackson's presidency are not politically correct. They are simply correct, and we need to pay attention to them. Jackson's heroic status in the 19th century reflected the values of an antebellum America that was committed to territorial expansion and slavery. Similarly, the placement of Jackson on the $20 bill likewise reflected the values of 1920s America that was dedicated to upholding a Jim Crow system of segregation and racial oppression. Well, I think we can all agree that a lot of history has unfolded since 1928, and with it has come an expansive notion of American citizenship, one that now includes women, ethnic and racial minorities, immigrants, and members of the LGBTQ community. This transformation has been accomplished by an increased willingness to confront the darker chapters of American history, like slavery, Indian removal, and Japanese internment. In light of this development, the choice of Harriet Tubman to replace Jackson makes a lot of sense. Symbolically, as a woman, an African American, and a former slave, Tubman stands for the Americans left out of Jackson's vaunted common man constituency. And it's not like Andrew Jackson is being deleted from American history. Hell, there are 40 cities and towns named for him across the United States. And Jackson still has a place of honor on the reverse side of the $20 bill. Placing Harriet Tubman on the front side of the new $20 bill reflects a broadened notion of what sort of Americans and what kinds of actions are worthy of our collective admiration and commemoration. Tubman embodied an essential and often undervalued American tradition of civil disobedience. Every chapter in the unfolding story of American freedom, democracy, and justice has been written by people who were willing to defy unjust laws, despite the attendant risks to their lives, reputations, and property. Tubman escaped slavery and then willingly risked her life innumerable times by returning to the South to guide others to freedom in the North along the Underground Railroad. Like later activists fighting for labor rights, women's rights, civil rights, and gay rights, just to name a few, she broke laws to expose their unjust character and to gain their repeal. What could be more American than that? And here's one final thing to ponder. It's no mere coincidence that the Tubman on the 20 movement has occurred at a time when public sentiment has also demanded the removal of pro-Confederate symbols from the public square, and when the Black Lives Movement is calling attention to the problem of violence against people of color, and when studies continue to show that women are paid far less than men. These facts should caution us against reading too much into the new $20 bill. Symbols are important, but they are not ends in themselves. the best ones call our attention to what we value and why. In 2016, the United States faces serious problems concerning violence, poverty, inequality, and racism. Harriet Tubman's arrival on the new $20 bill will not solve these problems. Its purpose, though, is to stand as a vivid and powerful symbol of freedom, equality, and inclusion. It's up to us citizens to make use of this symbol. We'll be right back, people, with a look at history in the news.
Conservative critics are calling it revisionist history with an anti-American bias. So
Abraham Lincoln's 200th birthday was a marked celebration for Springfield, Illinois.
Commemorating the 74th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor.
This morning, the Confederate flag is no longer flying over Fort Sumter, South Carolina, where Southerners fired the first shots of the Civil War.
All right, it is indeed time for the History Skinny with Stephanie Yuhl. Stephanie Yuhl is a historian and one of our special correspondents here at In the Past Lane. Stephanie, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so here's where we talk about history in the news. What jumps out at you as something worthy of our discussion today?
Well, there are a few things I want to talk about, but I thought I would start with John Kerry's visit to Japan recently and conversations around President Obama's visit to that country in May and the idea of whether or not he might make an apology for the dropping of the atomic bomb in 1945. I just think it opens up all sorts of interesting questions about history, questions about, do we apologize? What is the purpose of an apology? What is the meaning? Are they empty, symbolic gestures, or do they really have heft?
And has enough time passed? Maybe that makes an apology easier, but really, if you look back in the history, not just of the United States, but most countries, apologies just don't happen.
They don't happen. They tend to look like things we're sorry things were bad in the past. We regret stuff happened.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Always phrased in the passive voice.
Exactly. I'm sorry your feelings were hurt,
yes.
right? Instead
Mistakes
of what I did.
Were made.
Exactly. My mother used to say there are three parts of an apology: admitting what you did, saying you're sorry that you hurt somebody, and then the key part. It's not an apology without the third part, which is, and what can I do to make it up? And that is always the action piece that's missing from these kind of political apologies.
And I think that's also what they see as the danger part. You know, if you're going to apologize for slavery, does that immediately open, like the third part? What can you do to make it better? Does that open the question of reparations or anything like that?
Which there have been reparations in the past, right? I mean, we had reparations for interned Japanese Americans.
Right, in the 1980s.
Right.
So.
But I just find this interesting. The reason I find Japan particularly interesting is because as a country, it has a couple different ways that it's dealt with its World War II past. In Tokyo, it tends to remain really nationalistic, the Yakasuni Shrine being a lightning rod spot for those kinds of moments.
That's why they have the annual...
They have the annual pilgrimage. So the Yakasuni Shrine is a shrine to the war dead who served the emperor from the 19th century through the early 1950s. And the idea with Shinto religion is that those people's souls, the kami, those souls are actually in that shrine. And so when the prime minister comes and visits the shrine, that's a real kind of sanctioning of of an imperialistic, militaristic past, right? And one of the issues
way before World War II.
Way before World War II.
Thinks about World War II.
Exactly, and very much about this idea of Japan's place in a larger Asia as the ruler of larger Asia. So China, North Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, folks get very upset about these visits that happen from prime ministers and cabinet ministers. In particular, because there's been plenty of research done that folks from the outside say there are war criminals that are buried in that shrine, and so therefore this is a kind of imprimatur onto those kinds of criminal acts. So Tokyo has this militaristic, nationalistic view. Hiroshima, on the other hand, which one would think, because it was the city, August 6, 1945, the great victims of this horrific war act, 140,000 people dead by the end of the year, 70,000, I think, instantly. They've taken a different tack, which is to focus on their history as a harbinger of peace, not to refight old battles or reassert aggressive nationalist identities. So they have this amazing Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, which is right at the hypocenter of where the bomb dropped. There's this one structure that remains standing that had been an old arts and industrial building that they now called the A-bomb dome, the Genbaku dome. And it's really beautiful. And Kerry visited, and folks have been visiting, and I think that it does beg this question: what happens when Obama goes over in May for the G7 visit? And what should he do? And
because that's the question that's hanging in the air. Kerry went recently.
Yeah.
Now the question is, when Obama goes in late May, should he or will he go to Hiroshima? And if so, what should he do?
And what should he do, right? And then some people might say, well, should he visit Bataan? Because the Bataan Death March is. Should the Prime Minister of Japan come and visit Pearl Harbor? So I just think that it's a really interesting question. But I think it does make us wonder what do political apologies for historical acts mean? And I think they're very political. Japan is our ally. Japan is not a big threat. And then you look to, for example, Turkey and the Armenian genocide, which when Obama was a senator said this was a genocide. Why are we parsing words about this? Right. Let's say what it is. And he continues to stop short of using the word
since being elected
president, of using the word genocide and then insisting that Erdogan do something about it because of our military strategic position in Turkey. We need them in the Middle East. So it's really politics. It's politics brokering, which is a little upsetting, but it shouldn't be surprising.
History and memory intruding into politics, or politics intruding into history and memory. All right. Yeah. Well, I guess we'll find out in a few weeks when Obama visits Japan. So what's next?
So the next thing I thought, bringing this back to the U.S., was a recent development in Virginia where Governor Terry McAuliffe, who was a Democrat, used his executive order last week to restore voting rights to convicted felons in the state. And I thought this was really interesting because, first of all, it's politics. He's circumventing the Republican-run legislature.
Yep.
But why it's important to us, not only in the present, given questions about social justice and race in this country and Black Lives Matter and disfranchisement issues that are going on with voter ID laws, which we can talk about, but it's rooted in history. These laws that disfranchised felons, and the vast majority of whom would have been African Americans, are rooted in post-Civil War Reconstruction.
Right. So they've been around since the late 19th, early 20th century, and are very much a product of Jim Crow, of segregation, and of the post-Civil War fastening of an oppressive racial order on blacks.
Exactly. So it's a response to the 15th Amendment and this idea that rights won't be abridged by race or color or previous condition of servitude, right? And so all was fine and well for African Americans during Reconstruction, and then as soon as the federal troops withdraw and states start to write their own constitutions, the white men who ran the states reinscribed white supremacy through these kinds of laws. So things that most people are aware of, largely because of the battles that were happening in the 1960s to overturn things like poll taxes, where you'd have to pay.
Which we talked about 2 weeks ago
in
the Past Lane.
In the Past Lane is on it. Literacy tests, which of course were incredibly difficult, and
these were thinly veiled mechanisms to deprive blacks of the right to vote.
So it's a really interesting move, and it opens up this question about, again, race and politics and the legacies of these repressive white supremacist laws, and the way that they're still shaping the way that we interact today, and who gets to be rehabilitated, who gets to be a citizen. What's the purpose?
What's the purpose of prison? Is it just to punish people and then punish them beyond their sentences, or is there some hope? We've always had this question, like a penitentiary, literally, be a
penance.
Take time to think about what you've done and make amends. And if you are deprived of the right to vote in perpetuity, that does suggest that there's something else happening, that they're not really that interested in reinserting you into society.
And when you look at it through the numbers, when it says that the Sentencing Project talks about this being 1 in 5 African Americans or men are disfranchised in this country, and something like 6 million nationwide felons are because of some of these laws that are still in the book. So some states like Maine and Vermont have very loose laws where folks can vote, and then others, among them Kentucky, Maryland, Virginia, and I think Iowa, have the harshest laws.
Right. So no matter what, even if you've been out of jail for 20 years, you still can't vote.
It's a really serious social justice issue that's absolutely rooted in a history. And the thing about history, Professor O'Donnell, and this is why we teach it, is because it's often easier to look at the past and understand and see the mechanisms of power, to see this Mississippi State Constitution of 1890 as a repressive, racist document, and very difficult to see in one's own present, depending on where one sits socially in relation to those laws, what the sort of intent of those laws are.
Right, like the current voter ID.
Exactly.
It could be easily seen simply as a voter ballot box integrity issue.
Exactly,
and
an
in fact, 50 years
issue.
from now, people are going to look back with perspective and be able to see that it was, in many cases, and there's quite now documentation saying it was an effort to deprive certain people of the right to vote. Exactly. Well, I think clearly people need to study history more.
They do need to study history more, and they need to pay attention to this carceral state. The number of Americans who are imprisoned is outrageous. And
over 2 million.
Over 2 million, and the war on drugs has not succeeded. And this is something that there is a little bit of bipartisan support for, this question of too many people in prison. Now, it's for different reasons. For Democrats, it tends to be around race and justice, and for some Republicans, it tends to be simply around the cost.
Doesn't make any sense. So there's actually one of these rare moments of common ground in recent times between the two sides, saying that maybe we should reform our sentencing laws. Well, we'll see. 200,000 people getting their voting rights back, and maybe in other states. And then a third story.
The big story.
The big one. We've already been talking about it, but I'm
Yes, and I believe my friend Ed O'Donnell
actually
may have written a little piece for the HuffPost about this very question.
Tubman on the 20.
Tubman on the 20. So Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. This is a really interesting development. And again, it gets back to, are these just symbolic gestures, or are they really meaningful? Right. So initially, when I heard about the women on the 20 and who's going to be on the 20, I was excited about that. I thought that would be a great idea to get a woman on the 20. When I first heard it was Harriet Tubman, I was also excited for all the reasons you pointed out.
Because you would think it would Eleanor Roosevelt would be the kind of the safe go-to.
Right. And I think Harriet Tubman was an excellent choice. But Harriet Tubman being the leader of one of the Underground Railroad, a woman who was born into slavery, stole herself, and then became a person who shepherded folks into freedom. She was a real radical for freedom. But as this conversation's gone on as to who should be on the 20 and who shouldn't be, which is Andrew Jackson being kicked off, but not really kicked off, moved to the back.
Metaphorically very interesting. Back of the bus.
Yeah, I don't know what I think about that. So let's take a second to talk about Andrew Jackson.
It is a safety move, for one thing.
It is, but it's kind of an asterisk. There's an argument that says, so both histories now are there on that bill in tension. A slave-owning president who decimated native tribes, and then
in the name of slavery.
In the name of slavery, the extension of slavery, right? And then on the front, this hero of the Underground Railroad, African-American woman. But I don't like that compromise. I think they should have just kicked Jackson off, frankly.
Right. And he could, presumably, down the road, make his way back on. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows?
But he's been on there for almost 100 years.
He has, and people have moved on and off of bills all the time.
He bumped Grover Cleveland.
There you go. So it's not like these things are set in stone, which people don't really remember. I also want to say, I think it's interesting that this conversation started with Alexander Hamilton, but that Hamilton now is safe, and I think it's largely because of the musical.
Because of the musical. It is amazing how pop culture can really have this impact, but I think there clearly were Hamiltonian or ham and cheese Hamilton-ophiles out there, but the musical has just brought so many more people to the love of Hamilton that there was clearly a groundswell to keep going, including Lin-Manuel Miranda himself, who said, "Don't do it." Right,
don't do it. It's a boon for Revolutionary and colonial era historians, by the way. Hamilton is great for business, but anyway.
In fact, people have told you don't have to go very far as a historian for people to say, "Oh, you're a historian. I love, I just saw Hamilton," or "I love the soundtrack." Suddenly, essentially saying, because of Hamilton, the musical, history is now cool again, especially old history.
Let me tell you a really quick, funny story. One of our colleagues here at Holy Cross has a child who, for their share day in first grade, brought the Federalist Papers because to show and tell, because he so loved the musical. So there you go.
Really?
Isn't that fantastic?
And did he or she highlight any particular?
I'm really not sure. I wasn't in class that day.
Federalist number 10.
I wasn't in class that day. But back to Tubman. So at first glance, this seems like a wonderful kind of redressing of history and, and a sense of maybe holding in tension these issues, as I mentioned before.
And lots of joy. I mean, I think a lot of hand-wringing in certain quarters, but the overwhelming response seems to have been, social media-wise,
really positive.
My piece was very positive in the Huffington Post. But there is some very interesting other voices out there that have said, wait a minute, let's think about this. Let's not get too overwhelmed with what could be superficial symbolism.
A feminist blogger named Feminista Jones came out with a really fantastic piece.
It was in the Washington Post?
In the Washington Post.
And we'll put that on our website.
Great, yeah. It's called Keep Harriet Tubman and All Women Off the $20 Bill. And basically her argument is that Tubman fought to subvert capitalism. Right. She stole herself. She was not part of the system. She was a radical, was a gun-toting radical, right? Yep. And she wasn't in favor of free trade or competitive markets or capitalism. She was the opposite. Or derivatives or any of that kind of subprime. She was all about subverting the system. So while the campaign is well-intentioned, Feminista Jones argues really well that not only was Tubman herself is not an appropriate symbol for this, except as a rebel against it, right? That she's almost being co-opted in this process, almost tamed, domesticated, quote unquote, by putting her face on the bill of the very state, supporting the very process that enslaved her and against which she fought.
Right.
That's really smart. I think and when you think about how women continued, the pay gap for women continues to be so great, and it's even greater for African American women.
Yep.
That capitalism is no friend of women of color, and I think Feminista Jones is right on there. I find that a really important conversation for us to have.
Yeah, and maybe ultimately both perspectives will be served, which is that this is a great celebration moment. It's a great moment to bring Harriet Tubman and eventually Sojourner Truth and other women onto the currency, so that it sparks these conversations. But having Jackson still on the backside, having Hamilton still on the front of the 10.
Although they're supposed to put suffragettes on the back of the 10. Have you heard that?
Exactly. Yeah. So they're going to put the process has opened up. And maybe, if we want to be optimistic, having these symbols and people questioning them and all, maybe that's a good opportunity to make history much less a Mount Rushmore kind of a thing, and much more of a conversation starter, making people perpetually aware every time they pull a $20 bill out of their pocket of the fact that history is contentious and complicated.
Right. But I don't know if people are having those conversations. I hope so. And I hope, in fact, that In the Past Lane is part of that process.
Well, we're going to work
to get people to have those kinds of conversations. The other thing, too, is that I read an interesting piece about which Harriet Tubman do you put on the bill? The kind of frail older woman that we see in most of those photographs from the era, or the woman 40 years earlier in the 1850s and 60s who was doing this radical work. And there's a wonderful woodcut of Harriet Tubman where she has a gun.
Yeah.
And it was part of a National Portrait Gallery exhibit a couple of years ago. And so do we put a black woman with a gun on the 20, or do we put this more sort of sentimentalized, older, frail, kerchiefed African-American woman? And what will that play to in terms of sentiment, or really understanding her radical past?
Right.
And critique of the state and of the economic system.
Yeah, because it could be a feel-good symbol where we're saying, boy, remember when we once had slavery? And thank goodness people like Harriet Tubman helped end it, and thank goodness it's over, and this is to remind us of how we've progressed past that point. And you and I have talked about the same kind of problems, as have many other people, with the way Martin Luther King is depicted all the time, but especially around Martin Luther King Day, where it's just simply a lofty, I have a dream, let's all get along, and people are ignoring his much more radical and defiant and multifaceted radicalism that really made him a much more compelling, controversial figure.
Right now, my daughter's studying for the AP U.S. History test, and I Have a Dream speech is the thing they turn to. They do not look at the Time to Break the Silence on the Vietnam War speech at Riverside Church. Exactly a year to the date before he died, where he's critiquing militarism and capitalism and imperialism. But it's an interesting thing about Tubman, and let me just say this last thing, which is the problem with taking a historical figure and using them as a symbol in the present is that they cannot speak for that move. Tubman can't say, love to be on the 20, thank you. Or would say, are you kidding me? Yeah. Are you kidding me? Do you not know my story? So that's part of the problem. So there's a lot of interlocutors that are putting interpretations onto whether or not this is true to her life, and it's a appropriate honorific, a tribute to this incredible person.
All right, Stephanie, as always, thank you very much for dropping in to bring us up to speed at the History Skinny here at In the Past Lane.
One of my favorite things to do.
All right, good. We'll talk to you soon.
Excellent. Thanks, Ed.
In the Past Lane's senior historical correspondent, Stephanie Yuhl, is a historian and professor of history at Holy Cross College in Worcester, Mass. You can learn more about Stephanie and all her many publications and projects at our website, inthepastlane.com. Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. Well, people, that's going to do it for this episode of In the Past Lane. Thank you for listening. And please head to Twitter, Facebook, or our website, inthepastlane.com, to leave comments, questions, and suggestions. At our website, you'll also find links, essays, images, and further reading suggestions related to all the stuff we've talked about in this episode. And you can find out more about our guests, our correspondents, and other contributors. In the Past Lane is an independently produced podcast, so we rely on loyal listeners like you to help spread the word. So if you like this podcast, please follow us on Facebook and Twitter. I also hope you'll head to iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever else you access this podcast, and subscribe to In the Past Lane. Subscribing is free, and it sets you up so that new episodes of In the Past Lane automatically download to your listening device. And while you're at it, please leave a review. Reviews are incredibly important for pulling in new listeners. So please, take 60 seconds to leave one. Thanks. In the Past Lane has been made possible by the hard work and dedication of many people. They include technical advisors Holly Hunt and Jesse Anderson, photographer John Buckingham, graphic designer Maggie Salucci, executive producer Lulu Spencer, and the law offices of Tippecanoe and Tyler 2. Special thanks also to Jay Graham for creating the intro music, and to the Free Music Archive for providing the rest of the music for this episode. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world, so let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next week for another journey in the past lane. Lulu, you get the last word. How much do you love working here, kid?
I've got to update my resume.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.